Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Westminster Burial Ground, located in Baltimore, Maryland. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. The internet, social media, and glossy magazines are easy sells for historic destinations with beautiful sights for tourists seeking views. I'm not sure how many have a bucket list with Baltimore, Maryland on it, though. And please don't take this as a dig against this wonderful city. It's just not a tourist hotspot in or now, from what I understand. It is, however, the resting place of one of America's most famous authors, and what brings us to historic Baltimore, Edgar Allan Poe, the father of Gothic fiction and Romanticism in literacy. He's not the only historic figure on the grounds, but more of a headliner in this burial ground. Now known as Westminster Burial Ground, its original name was Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery when established in 1786. The burial ground was established prior to the adjoining church, Westminster Hall. The cemetery is located on Fayette and Green Street, downtown Baltimore, but was originally purchased as a peach orchard from a farmer named John Howard. In 1852, the church was constructed on brick piers above the graves. This created unique catacombs, feel, and history for the grounds, and became known as the Baltimore Catacombs to locals. The cemetery gates located on the Green Street side feature Egyptian Revival gates, designed by Maximilian Godfrey, giving a grand transition from the world of the living to the land of the dead when entering. Godfrey designed many of the prominent and famous structures in the city of Baltimore. He also designed many of the monuments within the cemetery as well. The church is no longer in service but able to rent out as a hall after being taken over in 1977 by the Westminster Presbyterian Trust, a private nonprofit organization, who've been caring for the graveyard and the reason behind the cemetery's restoration ever since. The gravestones throughout the burial ground include decorative tablets, slabs, and granite vaults with a romantic Gothic theme, making it a worthwhile stop for a tidbit of American history and to appreciate its beauty. Permanent residents from the American Revolution and the War of 1812 are also buried within. 15 of its permanent residents are generals alone, which is very impressive and a huge resting place of America's historic heroes that aren't mentioned in history books. American senator, representative from Maryland, a mayor of Baltimore, Maryland, and a general in the Maryland militia, General Samuel Smith, is interred. He served twice as President pro tempore of the United States Senate, first from 1805 to 1808, and later from 1828 to 1831. He was a driving force who became a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army with 200 soldiers in his regiment. Smith's regiment also had Major Robert Ballard of Virginia, Major Simon Thayer of Rhode Island, and Captain Samuel Treat of the Continental Artillery. The siege of Fort Mifflin, which lasted from September 26 to November 16 in 1777, was Smith's most famous achievement of the war. The defenders of the fort held out heroically against a bombardment by warships in the Delaware and by British batteries on the north bank. It's hard with a cemetery filled with so many heroes to go over each one. The most notable patriots, political civic leaders, and American Revolution and War of 1812 soldiers within are John Hollis, Robert Gilmore, John Strickler, Nathaniel Ramsey, James Sterling, John McDonough, Robert Coolin, Paul Benelou, and James Buchanan, but not the former President Buchanan, a different one. James McHenry also calls this ground his forever home. McHenry's name hopefully should sound familiar, as he was one of America's founding fathers. His story to America was a bit of a unique one, too, as his family originally sent him to North America in 1771 to recuperate from extensive studying to become a surgeon. When they also had ulterior motives, though, to use him as a scout to see if the rest of the family might want to make the jump across the pond and move more permanently to America, which they did, of course, a year later. McHenry did become a skilled physician, finishing his studies in America. He then joined the Continental Army, serving as a surgeon and member of the 5th Pennsylvania Battalion. He was captured after his commander, Robert McGaw, who surrendered in November of 1776. He uniquely observed the British gave extremely poor medical care to prisoners, attempting to report his findings, but nobody cared at the time. In 1778, he was finally released in a prisoner exchange and then selected to be George Washington's secretary. He remained in this position till 1780 when he was transferred to Lafayette's staff and then retired from the Army in 1781. Afterward, he then was elected to Maryland State Senate and went on to become the Secretary of War in 1796, being appointed by George Washington himself. McHenry's partake in America's establishment was a big one. During his service as the Secretary of War, he was responsible for reorganizing the United States Army into 4 regiments of infantry, a troop of dragoons, and a battery of artillery. He also was part of establishing the United States Department of the Navy, based on his recommendation that the War Department should be assisted by a Commissary of Marine on March 8th of 1798. As all politics play out, McHenry's unfavoritism of John Adams' policies when he became president and in his opinions of how he ran the country led eventually to McHenry's resignation. In the election of 1800, however, McHenry wasn't just done with Adams yet. He persuaded Alexander Hamilton into releasing his heirs against Adams. These heirs questioned Adams' loyalty and patriotism, sparking public quarrels over the major candidates and helped Thomas Jefferson become elected as the next president. And if you thought modern-day politics was cutthroat, imagine back then. Ouch. McHenry finally bought 95 acres of land, retiring from public life and passing away in 1816 years later. For all fun trivia listeners out there, Fort McHenry in Baltimore was named after him, which the for significance in the War of 1812 was the battleground that helped inspire Francis Scott Key to write the national anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner. Now for a little bit more grim history with the father of Gothic fiction, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, the resident you're most likely been all wanting to hear about. Poe's tale of life isn't the happiest by any means, and even in death, it's very uniquely Poe. His grave was originally unmarked within the grounds at the very back of the cemetery in 1849. This all changed when a group of school children raised money through a project called Pennies for Poe, and were able to dedicate a monument to the entrance of the cemetery, also having him reinterred with his wife, Virginia Clem Poe, and mother-in-law, Maria Poe Clem. Yet how does the author known as the father of Gothic fiction die and be buried in an unmarked grave? It's best to start at Poe's beginning, after being born in 1809 in Boston, to actors David and Elizabeth or Eliza Poe. His father then only a year later abandoned the family, with then his mother passing away another year later. Poe was taken in by John and Frances Allen of Richmond, Virginia, whom never officially adopted him for some reason, but he considered them family. He then went on to attend the University of Virginia, but was troubled with drinking and gambling debts, leading to fights with John Allen over his university expenses and funds. This didn't last for Poe, and he then enlisted in 1827 under an assumed name of Edgar A. Perry in the United States Army. He then claimed to be 22 at the time, but he was really only 18. Then publishing his first writing collections, Tamburlaine and Other Poems, but it was a credit to a Bostonian, not Poe's name. During his years in service, Frances Allen sadly passed away, leading to a temporary reapproachment of her husband John and Poe. This was also due to Poe confessing his true name to his commanding officer and attempting to be discharged from the army. His commanding officer, after Poe found a willing replacement to fill out his years of service, said he would only grant Poe's request if he reconciled with Allen. Poe then had been writing John Allen months up to Frances's death, but with no reply till after her final passing. After being discharged from the army, Poe decided to try his luck at being a cadet at West Point, but this was just as disastrous as his other choices in life. Oddly, during his brief service in South Carolina, Poe became entangled into a present-day haunting. If you're ever visiting Charleston, a stop on one of the many city tours tells the tale of Poe and Annabel Lee of an unrequited love lost. Poe was rumored to have fallen in love with a prominent member of society's daughter named Ravenel, who disapproved of the match to a penniless soldier. Meeting nightly in a local graveyard, they continued to see each other regardless, till Poe was stationed elsewhere. Well, meanwhile, Annabel contracted yellow fever and passed away before he could return. But he still tried to attend his beloved's funeral. Her father still was against the match even with her death, turned him away from her funeral, and even went to great lengths to make sure her intimate was a secret. The graveyard of their midnight rendezvous is claimed to be haunted by Poe seeking Annabel for eternity. No records officially support this story, but Poe did spend time on Sullivan's Island in South Carolina and did visit Charleston during the time frame Annabel was supposedly to have taken a suitor that makes the story possible. Yet the biggest piece of evidence that this urban legend might be true is Poe's own poem published in 1849 titled Annabel Lee. It was the last poem he penned about a young love so strong even the angels in heaven were envious. Poe deliberately had himself court-martialed out of West Point on February 8th of 1831. He was tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, or church. After West Point, Poe finally decided to turn his full focus on writing. He spent the next several years working for literary journals and periodicals, becoming known for his own style of literary criticism, publishing in 1831 his third volume of poems titled Poems. The book was financed with the help from his fellow cadets from West Point. A page within is dedicated to their help, saying, "To the U.S. Corps of Cadets, this volume is respectfully dedicated." 1836, Poe married his first cousin, Virginia Clem. Clem was just 13 years old at the time. Some biographers suggest they viewed one another more like brother and sister, living prior to their marriage together on and off for several years with family members. Due to his employment in various cities, the couple lived in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, jumping from city to city. Poe published stories, poems, started his own journal, novels, and also became an editor. He was the first writer to have an income alone from writing, but this of course wasn't a rich profession at the time by any means. This led to Poe repeatedly resorting to humiliating pleas for money and other assistance from not being paid or underpaid, often from publishers. This was during the time of the Panic of 1837, when America experienced a financial crisis leading into a major depression to the 1840s. Finally, on January 29th of 1845, Poe's poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror, instantly finding fame. Yet with fame also came scandal. Edgar Allan Poe was caught writing letters to two women, Frances Sargent Osgood and Elizabeth F. Elliot, in the Literary Society, with many of them becoming flirtatious and immoral in nature. In fact, Poe was also rumored to have written several poems about Osgood, one being A Valentine, leading to the jealousy of Elliot and her competing against Osgood for the affections of Poe, regardless that he had a wife. Virginia did discover the women's letters, which led to the return of them and the end of Poe's affairs. In January of 1842, Poe's wife Virginia showed the first signs of tuberculosis, a common killer in their time, causing even more instability for Edgar Allan, who continued drinking even heavier from her declining health. The Poes moved to a cottage in the Bronx soon after, where Virginia would live out her final years, eventually in January of 1847 passing away. The only known painting of Virginia Clem Poe is a watercolor portrait painted several hours after her death. The themes in Poe's writing are thought to be influenced by his continuous loss of beautiful women throughout his life. First his birth mother Eliza, then Frances Allan, who was like a foster mother to him, possibly Annabel Lee, and his wife Virginia. The unraveling of Poe's life after his wife's death was short-lived but full of dark years. He attempted to court poet Sarah Helen Whitman of Rhode Island, but it was over before it even began, with Poe's erratic and drunken behavior and her mother's disapproval. He then went to Richmond, Virginia, and reassumed a relationship with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster. Just 3 years after Virginia's passing, in 1849, Poe was found semi-conscious in Baltimore, in great distress and in need of immediate assistance, according to Joseph W. Walker, who found him outside a tavern. He was found wearing clothes that weren't his own, crying out loud, "Reynolds," and was thought to be intoxicated. Edgar Allan Poe died 4 days later on Sunday, October 7th of 1849 at 5 o'clock in the morning, his last words saying, "Lord help my poor soul," leading to more mystery than anything. Yet even in death, the world wasn't done with Edgar Allan Poe. In fact, things were about to look even grimmer. His cause of death even today remains a mystery, but the speculation includes delirium tremens, heart disease, epilepsy, syphilis, meningeal inflammation, cholera, carbon monoxide poisoning, and rabies, or even cooping. Somehow his literary rival Rufus Wilmot Griswold was also able to write Poe's high-profile obituary, but under the pseudonym Ludwig. He described Poe as a lunatic, and as a person who walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers, but never for himself, for he felt or professed to feel he was already damned. Griswold made it his job to ruin Poe even in death, and somehow became his literary executor, writing a bibliography article of Poe called Memoir of the Author, which he included in an 1850 volume of collected works, where he depicted Poe as a depraved, drunken, drug-addict madman, and included Poe's personal letters as evidence. This, of course, was all a complete falsehood by those who knew Poe and was seriously disputed. Griswold also didn't get the exact reaction he was looking for, as many wanted to read Poe's works, thinking they were reading works by an evil man. Edgar Allan Poe, even in death, was able to outlast his bitter rivals' attempts of slander, and Griswold eventually was guilty of forgery. The personal letters of Poe he used and cited in his bibliography were all fakes, made up by Griswold in an attempt to add evidence to his article. Poe's legacy continues to this day, with his writing featuring recurring themes with questions of death, including its physical signs, the effects of decomposition, concerns of premature burial, the reanimation of the dead, and mourning. He is also considered the father of detective fiction, leading to inspire Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, and the great horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. Poe's format and detail into his stories and analytical abilities allowed him to see details that the general public was largely ignorant of. The methods by which a simple substitution cryptogram can be solved, and he used this to his advantage for his writing. He also had a deep interest in cryptology. Writing The Gold Bug, he incorporated ciphers in an essential part of the story. In 1841, Poe published 2 ciphers under the name W.B. Tyler that had remained unsolved till 1992 and 2000. His abnormal death to a pauper's grave then leads us back to the pennies for Poe in full circle of just how did we get here. Just as his life, his retirement saw trouble again too. Poe's grave originally had a headstone of white Italian marble made, but it was destroyed before it reached the grave, when a train derailed and plowed through the monument yard where it was being kept. Instead, it was marked with a sandstone block that read number 80. Years later, a poet by the name of Paul Hamilton Hayne visited Poe's grave and published a newspaper article describing his grave's condition, leading to public intrigue. A Baltimore school teacher then took interest in the public's intrigue to her students, and they in turn started the Pennies for Poe Fund, with even public performances given to help raise money. People throughout the U.S. donated to the cause, a Philadelphia publisher donating a large sum, and even philanthropist George William Childs. Poe's new monument cost a total of $1,500, with even a medallion of Poe included. All 3 men chosen for the redesign were from Baltimore, respectively. On October 1st of 1875, Edgar Allan Poe was reburied and laid to rest at a new location near the front of the church. A small celebration was held with a dedication made from one of his cousins, Nelson Poe. Several famous poets were invited to attend, but only Walt Whitman did. As with nothing going according to plan in Poe's life, the new burial spot was marked with a large stone donated by Orrin C. Painter, though it was originally placed in the wrong spot and resolved quickly. Finally, Poe saw his troubles laid to rest, next to his wife Virginia in 1885 in the cemetery. Virginia's story within was that her grave was accidentally destroyed, but because she had no kin to claim her remains, was almost lost to history. Luckily, William Gill, who wrote a biography on Poe, gathered her remains and kept them oddly in a box hidden under his bed, till the 76th anniversary of her husband's birth saw her remains reburied with Edgar's. Poe's long but tragic story finally was at its very end. In oddity and homage to Poe in around the 1950s, an unidentified person for several decades, or most likely several people, paid annual tribute to Edgar, marking his original grave in the cemetery every year on his birthday, January 19th. A shadowy figure dressed in black with a wide-brimmed hat and white scarf would pour himself a glass of cognac or sherry brandy, raising a toast to the American author, then would vanish into the night, leaving 3 roses in a distinct arrangement, and an unfinished bottle of liquor. For some time, others attempted to get a glimpse of who exactly was leaving Poe a toast, but they were never able to identify the person. In 2011, however, the toast sadly ceased to an end. But in 2016, the Maryland Historical Society decided a new toaster to revive the tradition that lives on to this day. Many believe Poe's spirit is not at rest haunting the grounds. People have reported seeing his ghost walking around the gravesite and even standing at the altar inside Westminster Hall. Many believe Poe's spirit is not fully at rest haunting the grounds. People have reported seeing his ghost walking around his gravesite and even standing at the altar inside Westminster Hall. The ever-popular legend of the Skull of Cambridge also takes place in this burial ground. It's said the head of a murdered minister was placed in a segment of cement. This was to conceal the sounds of the screams from the skull. It's claimed the skull screams at all times of day and lingers in the minds of those who've heard it. Its victims who've heard it scream have experienced insanity and were placed in psychiatric wards after being exposed for prolonged periods of time, believing to still hear the screams. The most commonly seen ghost or haunting in the burial ground is of 16-year-old Lucia Watson Taylor. Lucia passed away in 1816. She's often seen kneeling in front of her own grave in a flowing white dress with long dark hair. She then clasps her hands in prayer, fading away before visitors' eyes. Reports of any visitors attempting to make trouble within the grounds have a 19th century groundskeeper that is said to walk row by row calling out if you speak too loudly. He then strolls away, slowly fading to the eye. Claims of footsteps being grabbed by unseen icy cold hands, unexplainable cold spots, and odd stenches have all been experienced on the grounds. The Westminster Burial Ground might house American heroes, war veterans, and others who served the United States from her very beginning, yet the grim tale of Poe overshadows much of their history today. Perhaps maybe not in the best fashion, but Poe's contribution to American literacy is certainly unmatched by many, and changed the course of fiction forever after his however brief life lived. I might have missed some details out of Poe's life, but it's hard when someone who lived so briefly lived his years dramatically, full of life aligned with great tragedy, leaving decades of impressions on even young writers today. Perhaps it's best to leave Westminster with Poe's own words, quote the Raven, Nevermore. The grave grind for Westminster Burial Ground was an iced macchiato from Morning Mugs in Federal Hill. For more honorary grinds in the area, please visit the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on Westminster Burial Ground. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today, and join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.